In the last video, we took a look at how this application works, so in today's video, we're going to break this application down into multiple different parts and components, which will allow us to build those components inside of React much easier. And the first and obvious separation in this application is the left and right side of the screen. On the left-hand side here, we have our recipe list. This is essentially the list of all of our different recipes. And on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the edit section for the current recipe that we've selected. So this right here is already two components for our application. But we can break it down even further. We also see that we have a particular recipe over here, and we have another recipe down here. They're exactly the same, so these are also another component inside of our recipe list that we can use. And again, we can break it down even further because we have an ingredient list right here, as well as individual ingredients inside of that list. It's very similar for the other side. We have our recipe edit section, and inside of here, we have our ingredients section for editing, as well as each individual ingredient, which are all individual components that we can have inside of our application. So in this video, we're going to take a look at actually building out the components that allow us to display our recipe list over here, as well as each of our individual recipes. I'm also going to turn off my webcam so it doesn't get in the way of any of the coding that we're going to be doing. So let me do that real quick. There we go. And now we can just jump over into Visual Studio Code here, and we can start with our components. And as I mentioned, the very first component we have is a recipe list. This list contains all of our individual recipes, as well as our add recipe button at the very bottom here. So let's create that component. We can just come over here, create a new file, and we're going to call this recipe list.js. And now the very first thing we need to do is actually create our component. But in order to make this a bit easier, we're going to install an extension in Visual Studio Code. And this extension has got a quite lengthy name, but if you type in ES7 and React up here, you'll see ES7, React, Redux, GraphQL, React Native, blah, 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 blah. Essentially, this is a bunch of different snippets that you can use. And we just want to install this extension. And now what we can actually do inside of our code is if we type in RFC, this just stands for React Functional Component, and we click enter, it brings up all the boilerplate code for us to build out a React functional component. It imports React, sets up the basic default export for us, and it also creates a component with the same name as whatever your file is, so in our case, recipe list here. This is incredibly useful for getting started. The next thing that I mentioned that we're going to need is an individual component for the recipe itself. As you can see here, we have our plain chicken recipe and our plain pork recipe, and each one of those is their own component. So let's create that new file. We're just going to call it recipe.js, and we can do the exact same thing, RFC, React Functional Component, and boom, that's going to create our component for us, and it's super straightforward. So now instead of our recipe list, we're just going to default this to be two recipes. So we're just going to use here some fragments to put these recipes in here, and inside of here we're going to put a recipe, just like that, close it off, and we're going to put another recipe afterwards, and we'll just make these self-closing tags because it's a little bit easier to work with. Make sure we delete all this extra code that we don't need. There we go. Now we have two recipes. We just need to make sure that we import our recipe, and of course this is going to be coming from our /recipe, just like that. And now if we save both of these files and we go into our app right here, what we want to do is we want to import our recipe list, and we want to make sure we import that from recipe list. And then inside of here, what we can do is we can actually just return that recipe list. So we can just render right here, whoops, if I spell that correctly, recipe list. We can close that off. We'll just make it self-closing because it's easier again. Now when we save that, we actually have our recipe list. Of course, nothing's actually being rendered because recipe is just completely empty, but we can start adding our components into recipe. In order to build this recipe component, we need to look at all the different sections of our recipe. The first thing we have is we have our title section up here, which is our header. Then we have our content, and then we have the ingredients section. We're actually going to ignore the ingredients section for now because that's actually going to be a separate component. We're just going to put everything else inside of this component. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create a div, which is going to be for our header section. And inside of here, we want to put our title, which is just going to be inside of an H3. And we can just put in some placeholder text for now. We're going to make this dynamic and reactive later, but for now, we're just going to use hard-coded text in here. So we have our plain chicken, and we also are going to have a div, which is going to contain our two buttons. So we're going to have our edit button, which is just going to say edit. And we're going to have another button down here, which is going to be delete. Now again, we're not going to add any add event listeners, clicks, or anything to these. It's just going to be static HTML for now. Next, outside of our header, what we want to do is we want to add all of our content for our different rows that we have here. So each one of these divs is going to be a row, and inside those rows, we're going to have two separate spans. The first one is going to be the actual name, so in our case, cook time. And then the second one down here is going to be our actual value. So in our case, this is 145. As you can see over here, again, this is just placeholder text for now. Let's copy this row down a couple times because we have multiple rows in our application, as you can see here. So the next one is going to be servings. So we can just type that out. and we want to make sure this is 3. Whoops, 3. And then the last one here is going to be instructions. And instructions is going to be a little bit different because we want this to be on a separate line. We're actually going to use a div here instead of a span. So let's make sure this is a div, and we want to put our instructions inside of this div. So we're going to have right here our first instruction, which is just going to say put salt on chicken. Next one, whoops, is going to be number 2, and this is going to be saying put chicken in oven. And then lastly, number 3, which is eat the chicken. Whoops, there we go. Now we actually have our recipe being rendered. So let's actually look at what our app looks like. We can just come down here and say npm start. And when we run that, it's going to take a little bit to get started, but as soon as it gets started, we should see that we have our recipes being shown up on the right-hand side here, and we should have 2 recipes. As you can see, if we zoom in a little bit, we have our plain chicken, our edit delete button, as well as our 3 different rows for everything that we're showing, and then it's being duplicated down here, and that's just because in our list, we're rendering 2 separate recipes, and of course they're not dynamic yet because we're just using placeholder content. Now, in order to actually make our content dynamic, let's actually just add an array of recipes into our app, which is just going to be our sample recipes. We can just come down here and we can create a const. We're going to call it sample recipes. And we just want to set this equal to an array, and each one of these arrays is going to have an object. The first key is going to be the ID. In our case, we'll just have an ID of 1 for our first one. We're going to give it a name, in our case, plain chicken. And this is just going to essentially follow all the information that we have over here. So we're going to have also servings. Whoops, servings. This is going to be 3. We're going to have cook time. And this over here is just going to be a string, which is our cook time, 145. We're also going to want to have our instructions. And I'm just going to copy this because I don't want to type it all out again. So let's copy this in here. And we want to make sure that we put this inside of a string, of course. And we also want to make sure that we actually add in our characters because this is on a new line. So we want to add our new line breaks in here, which is just \n like this. This is going to put it on a new line. So now we have 3 separate lines in our instructions. And then we're not going to worry about the ingredients part of this yet because, like I said, we just want to render the actual recipe itself. So what we want to do is add another recipe in here. I'm just going to copy this because it's going to be very similar. And our recipe here is going to have an ID of 2. We're going to call this one plain pork. The servings for this one is going to be slightly different at 5. Cook time is going to be again slightly different at 0.45. And over here we want to do put paprika on pork because this is going to be pork. We want to put the pork in the oven and we want to eat the pork. So now we actually have our sample recipes, but we're not using it anywhere yet. If we save this, you can see everything over here is still going to look exactly the same. But in our recipe list, we actually want to pass in a prop. And like I mentioned, props are going to be passed in just like attributes. So we can just say we want a prop, which is all of our recipes. And we're going to just set this to our sample recipes. So now when we load our application, it's going to pass down all of our sample recipes inside this recipes prop to our recipe list. So in our recipe list, we can just use destructuring here to get our recipes, just like this. And now instead of putting our recipes in here like this, we can actually loop through our recipes array and render each one of those as a component. And to do this is actually really straightforward. Let's remove all this code here, and what we want to do is we want to render just some JavaScript. We want to loop through our recipes, so we'll say recipes.map. And for each one of our recipes, what we want to do is we want to run the code inside of this section here. Also, I want to make sure that we include this inside of a div, because that'll be able to just render much better. So we can put our div right here. This will allow us to do styling later on. So now we have our recipes.map, and inside of this for loop here, we essentially have each one of our recipes. And all we want to do is just return a recipe. So we can return a recipe like this. And since we want to pass each one of the values from recipe into the props individually, so we want to, for example, have here an ID is going to be equal to recipe.id. We want to do the same thing for the cook time, etc. There's actually a really easy way to do that using the spread operator. We can just put in here ... recipe, and what this is going to say is going to take all of the different key value pairs of recipe and put them as an individual attribute on recipe. This means that when we're inside of our recipe class here, we can actually say here, let's say this is our props, we can say props.id, and that's going to be the ID of our recipe. But if all we did was pass in something like this, where we said recipe is equal to recipe like that, what we would have to do is say props.recipe.id, and we don't want to do that. So what we're going to use, if we remove this here, is just that other way of doing things with the spread operator, because this allows us to pass down all of our properties as top levels of the prop instead of being nested inside the recipe itself. And now if we save that, you can see that we are getting this error over here, and that's just because we need to change this to recipe. I had that misspelled, and now if we save that, you see again, we're getting an error, and that's because we need to make sure we return this recipe. So we can just put return here, make sure that we just make this a self-closing because it's just easier to work with. Save that, and you can see now we have our plain chicken being rendered up here. and our plain chicken getting rendered down here, and that's just because our recipe is not actually doing anything with these values. But we do have a very subtle error. If we inspect our page, go over to our console, if I can actually get that, there we go, you can see it says we have a warning, each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So if we see over here our recipe doesn't have any unique key to it. What we need to do is we need to set an actual key. So we say key, and we want to set that to recipe.id. Let's put this onto multiple lines so it's easier to read, just like that. Whoops, indent that, there we go. So now if we save it, you'll see that this warning is going to go away. And the way that React uses these keys is it uses the keys to know what different parts of the array it needs to re-render. So for example, if the recipe with ID 1 changes, but the recipe with ID 2 does not change, it will only re-render the recipe with ID 1 and not the recipe with ID number 2. This is just a way for React to be more efficient when re-rendering your props, and it won't unnecessarily re-render things it doesn't need to. But essentially for you, all you need to know is that anytime you have an array like this where you return an array of results, you need to make sure you add a key to each one of the values inside of that array that you're returning, because otherwise React won't know which ones to re-render, and it'll re-render all of them every single time, which is definitely not ideal. Since this recipe line is getting a little bit long, one thing that we can do is actually put it onto multiple different lines. This just makes your code easier to read and cleaner to work with. So if we do this, this is exactly the same thing. If we can save, you see everything over here is exactly the same. So it works exactly the same, it just makes it cleaner to work with, especially as we start adding more and more props to this object. You can just add them on separate lines instead of having one really long line. And now we are finally almost at the point where we can start actually populating this with our sample recipes. All we need to do is go into our recipe, and we need to pull in all the variables we need. The first one we need is a name variable, which we are getting from our actual application. So we come in here, we know that our recipe has a name to it, so we're going to get name in here. We also know that we want to get the cook time, so we can replace this with a cook time variable, just like that, and we know that that's going to be coming in as well from our props from our recipe. Lastly, we have servings down here, so we can change this to be, servings. There we go, make sure we close that off. And up here, we can make sure that we import that as well. And we have our instructions down here, so let's remove all of this and just put in instructions. And again, we can just pull this in from up here, just like that. And now if we save this, you'll see immediately everything is dynamic. We have our plain pork, which has our cook time, servings, and recipe being set, as well as our pork down here, which has different servings, different cook time, different instructions. So all of that is working really well. One thing you will notice though is this line is a little bit cluttered. It looks a little bit hard to work with. So something that happens in React a lot is when you have a lot of props being passed in like this, what you will do is you'll actually use destruction a little bit later. So up here, you'll keep this as props, and you'll move this destructuring component of it down. So in here, we'll have a const, and we're going to set it here equal to that variable, just like this. And this just allows us to do this on multiple lines much easier. There we go. So now that's our destructuring taken care of, and all we want to do is we want to set that equal to props. And what this is doing is exactly the same thing as when we had this object inside of our arguments, but it makes it much easier to work with since now it's all on multiple lines and easier to read. So if we save that, as you can see, it populates everything over here just as before. So to recap, in this video, what we did is we took originally our list over here of all of our different components. So if we zoom this out, we have all of our different components that we said, here's our recipe list, here's our recipe, for example, our edit section, and we decided what all of our components will be in React. Then what we did is we came over and we started building those different components by starting with the easiest ones, which is the recipe list, as well as the recipe itself. We didn't make any of it stateful or reactive, but we did set up here a default list of sample recipes just so we can see a little bit of variance in our design and make it so that we can use the props to initially set all of our values just like we did over here. In the next video, we're going to take a look at finishing the JSX for this left portion of our page, which is going to be that ingredient list as well as the individual ingredients. And then from there, we can actually add in the reactiveness to our application by adding state and effects and all of that fun stuff that we did in the previous application with the counters, but now with a much more real world example. So I really hope you're excited to get started with that because I know I am.